You know, these days, people often talk about how we create our own reality. And what often they mean, and what often they're understood to mean, is that through some process, perhaps it's a strictly, mental, psychological process, perhaps it's a little bit more mystical and magical than that, we actually construct the world around us. We know, of course, there are lots of philosophical and psychological ways to understand that, although it certainly seems that nowadays many people do understand that to mean that we're literally engaging in some way with the cosmos to tangibly create what we see. Some people might talk about how we agree on what we see or don't agree on what we see, or whatever the case may be. Interestingly, our friends the Stoics from all those centuries ago would entirely agree that we create our own reality, but not in the same way, not in some process where we're actually causing the physical world to emerge. According to the Stoics, how we value things and how we respond to them is the reality that we assign to them. Our inner discourse creates what they are, and the inner discourse is not the same as objective reality. This is a very key Stoic principle, and it's the principle of assent, what we agree to. And in fact, I've often spoken about how the importance of the key Stoic principle of only being in control of only worrying about what you're in control of, only having to deal with what you're in control of. Well, this then takes us to perhaps the most important concept, and that is the concept of assent, because, as I've just said, assent effectively creates our reality, what we agree to. So the process of assent is essentially 4 stages that happen as we encounter reality. Firstly, we perceive something external to ourselves, a thing or an event or something like that. And pretty much immediately and pretty much involuntarily and unconsciously, we create a value judgment or some kind of judgment about that thing. So something happens or something is there, and we immediately assign it some value to ourselves, from things like whether we care about it or not to what it really means and what it really is. So now we've got that. That judgment essentially turns into a proposition, as in, what do I do about those kind of things? How I'm going to handle that kind of thing. So that's the third step. Once I've got my idea of what that is or what that is to me, I've now got something that guides how I handle that in some way. And finally, we either agree with it, yes, that works for me, yes, I like that, yes, I think that's great, or we reject it. Or sometimes none of the above. We just don't even go there. But there's this whole process kind of where we make it ours. That is what is meant by creating our own reality. And if you think about that process of how we translate it into something of ourselves, it's kind of clear that we obviously often fail to recognize that we are applying a value judgment to how we perceive things, that in fact our perception of things is not very objective, because it is always filtered through what we judge about that and what we assent to. It is our assent to those value judgments that creates the emotions with which we experience the world. And as the Stoics point out very importantly, the emotions which impede our happiness. So, because we've decided what it is, we are the ones who've applied our judgment to it, and therefore our judgment about whether it's a good thing or a bad thing and what we feel about it. It's all coming from us and isn't objective to it. The discipline of assent is about kind of refusing to accept within yourself any way of seeing something or perceiving something that is not objective. It is creating this calm inner space which tries to be objective, that says, what is this thing without my judgment? We develop judgments about the way most things are represented. Marcus Aurelius, the Stoic, tells us, do not elaborate to yourself what is beyond what your initial impressions report. If you have been told that someone is talking about you behind your back, that's all it is. You haven't been told you've been harmed. Don't act like you have. Stay within your first impressions. Don't add your thoughts and then give value to your thoughts and then act as if your thoughts were real. A good example of that might be in the morning traffic. You're driving to work one day and another driver cuts you off in the rush hour traffic. The impression of immediate danger, collision, something like that, is registered by your mind. So you assent to the danger. Your mind interprets, agrees, there is danger, and responds appropriately by slamming on the brakes to avoid hitting the other car. You've now avoided hitting the other car. But what you might not be aware of is the almost involuntary and unconscious value judgment that applied to that impression. Inconsiderate, what an idiot, what a jerk, who does he think he is? And so the emotion arises from the value judgment. And the emotion that arises from the value judgment could inspire you to communicate your annoyance. You might honk your horn, scream out the window, pull a sign at someone, or worse. I mean, people get really mad in cars, as we know. So your assent to that value judgment is now causing you all this emotional angst. Your sympathetic nervous system, which was initially engaged in dealing with the anger, kicked into action, slammed on the brakes, did all of that. It now kicks into overdrive. Your heart is beating, your blood pressure rises, your vision narrows, focuses on the enemy, the danger, and the blood flow goes flight, and you are no longer thinking about us, brakes are important, blah, blah, blah. You have turned the whole thing into a negative emotional experience. The Stoics call that negative emotion, pathos. This is a bad emotion. And the response, this emotion, didn't actually result from the driver cutting you off. You might think it did, but it didn't. What resulted from the driver cutting you off is you slamming on the brakes. That was the correct reaction. But what arose out of your thoughts about that event was the negative emotion you feel. He's an idiot. He shouldn't have done that. That's illegal. All of those are the additional thoughts. The neutral situation, you assented to the impression of immediate danger, you put on the brakes. That is assent. If you had stopped with that, the negative emotion wouldn't have been created. But eventually your parasympathetic nervous system would have countered your flight or fight response by saying there's no more danger. I'm not in any danger. I've saved the day. And you would have returned to your calm demeanor and carried on driving to wherever you're going. Instead, your assent to the judgment that the driver harmed you created a negative emotional response that is now driving you and could get you into a lot of trouble. As we know, road rage can cause the most outrageous things. And it's not only road rage, it's lots of consequences that occur in our lives that are really arising out of this value judgment that we assent to. So we need to look at how we judge things. Marcus tells us, if you are grieving about some exterior thing, it is not that thing which is troubling you, but your judgment about that thing. And that really applies to pretty much every emotion. And so, the Stoics have this reputation for being uncaring, dispassionate, and so on. It's not cold and unemotional. It's calmly centered. We acknowledge that all these emotions exist, but we say, those are not the reality. Those are the judgments I've added onto the reality. The reality is an objective, straightforward, something happened. Terrible things happen, indeed. It doesn't mean Stoics don't think they're terrible, but Stoics think I need to preserve what stands in all of that is me. The external thing which causes grief is there, and I can judge that, but if I allow it to trouble me further and further and further, that is coming from me. That's happened. That's gone. Hurt, pain, grief, those are reactions to things. They aren't the things. So assent is a form of mindfulness. Do we give assent to our emotional impressions or not? Rather try and give assent to the objective thing. He cut in front of me, I put on the brakes, therefore. The thing is, he cut in front of me. I give assent to that. That's real, that happened, I'm putting on my brakes. Everything else is my judgment of it, which is often an assessment of self-injury or feeling sorry for ourselves. And certainly in that road rage example, that is what's going on there. And if we are stuck, there's nothing we can do about something, Marcus tells us, then do something else. Remain in control of what you're in control of. Don't let anything disturb that inner peace, what he calls the inner citadel, what the Stoics call the inner citadel, that place within yourself where peace and calm reign. And, it's the same like when we get sick, we feel sorry for ourselves, we expect sympathy from others. All of those things don't change the situation. We have to assent to the sickness cannot be changed by others. It has its own thing. How I respond to it is, if I feel sorry for myself, poor me, all of those, that is not what sickness is. The sickness is this bacteria is in my body, this injury happened, whatever it is. So the same we can say about death. What is it that we fear about death? The answer to that is actually our own judgment, beliefs, and suspicions about death, because we don't know what death is. We've got a limited idea of what death is, but it makes no sense to fear death because we judge it as fearful. We don't use any rational information on that. I mean, we can try, we can do things like, well, all that we do know is that there's nothingness with death. So then that's all we can say. But the reasons we might fear it are emotional and belief things. It is really the principle that there is nothing that is inherently good or bad, but that we decide it's so. The only value judgment, says Marcus, that is authentic is when good is moral good, when evil is moral even, and evil, and that means with respect to the society. The Stoics are very concerned that we act within the bounds of our society, which is another also way of saying we must act with respect to the equality and equanimity of everyone around us. So things which are not morally good or morally bad are indifferent, and they don't have any values. Things which are morally wrong, of course, things like harming other people, there isn't an argument that that's wrong. So it's that outside of those things, everything is indifferent. So we must judge our own impressions about things. Epictetus, Marcus's teacher, says, whenever external things are more important to you than your own integrity, then be prepared to serve them for the remainder of your life. That is a powerful, to-the-point statement. When external things are more important to you, be prepared to serve them rather than yourself. Once things happen, time can't be rewound. Putting big judgments onto things after the fact just disturbs our peace of mind. It's happened. The second we add those judgments, we step outside of that inner citadel where peace and tranquility reign. We step into the world of externals, which are not under our control. Remember, the Stoics tell us everything that should concern us is only the things under our control. And when we engage with things that are not under our control, we expose ourselves to and eventually do experience psychological angst. We're not in control. So sooner or later, it's going to disturb us, even if it starts off seeming good. Because it's not controllable or predictable, it's eventually going to cause an emotional reaction that disturbs our inner peace. The walls of the inner citadel are impenetrable, the Stoics tell us. Our soul is serene when our guiding principle limits ourselves to things which are up to us. But externals drive us, things outside of us appeal to us: wealth, power, fame, pleasure. Once we begin to pursue things outside of ourselves, our inner citadel, our peace, our calm becomes vulnerable, because it's the externals that are going to generate these reactions which disturb the inner citadel. And we can quickly become overwhelmed by all the emotions and angst created by these judgments and desires that all the externals are trying to generate in us. Marcus tells us in the 11th book in the Meditations of Marcus Aurelius, to live one's life in the best way, the power to do this resides within our soul, if we are capable of being indifferent to indifferent things. And we can be indifferent to indifferent things if we consider each of these things in each of its parts and in its totality, remembering that none of them can produce within us a value judgment about them. They cannot reach us, externals. Rather, things remain immobile, whereas it is we who engender judgments about them, and, as it were, write them down within ourselves. But it is possible for us to not write them down. It is also possible, if we have not succeeded in not writing them down, to erase them. Because, of course, that inner citadel is where we are in control. It is such a powerful thought. It's such a modern sounding thought, as Marcus describes it over there. But, it's been true for nearly 2,000 years or more. In philosophy, it's always been true. And that is, whatever those external things are, they are external. They aren't doing the emotional stuff, because the emotional stuff is internal. And once we learn to tell the difference between those two things, we discover that what creates the link that shouldn't be there is this value judgment. The discipline of assent is ultimately about eliminating value judgments of things which don't depend on us and therefore don't have any moral value. There isn't a reason to judge it good or bad, because it doesn't refer to my place in the world or my effect on the world. And therefore, I don't have to make a judgment about it. One of the modern commentators on the Meditations of Marcus is the philosopher Pierre Hadot, who has translated the work and has written in depth about Marcus. And he says, the phenomena of nature and events of the world, once they are stripped of all the adjectives, terrifying, frightening, dangerous, hideous, repulsive, which humankind in its blind anthropomorphism applies to them, appear in all their savage beauty. We can see things for what they truly are. So he's saying we attach emotional values to them because we anthropomorphize. We make things like ourselves. Because we're humans, we imagine that everything kind of behaves the same way. We even do that with our pets, who really, we know they have emotions and they have thoughts, but they aren't humans. We anthropomorphize things. So everything has got this quality to it, which are really words that apply to emotional beings. He says, strip them of all of that and see things as they really are. Thanks to the discipline of assent, the transformation of ourselves and of the world brings about a transformation of our consciousness of ourselves. The self becomes aware of itself as an island of freedom in the midst of a great sea of necessity. So we need to find the true self, because ultimately what we're seeing that Marcus and the Stoics say is that the key of the solution of all of this is to find the true self, to find the inner citadel, to find the calm centered self that says, I am moral in how I behave and understand the world, but I won't be affected emotionally by all the buttons that it wants to push all the time, because that is what causes unhappiness and grief and disturbs my life and my day. Think about it. All the stuff that disturbs your life and your day, stuff that isn't in your control, and it's stuff that you are reacting to. So in the meditations, Marcus says we've got to circumscribe the self. He says, understand yourself. The self is body, breath, and mind. He says the body and the breath are under your care, but not in your control. The mind is in your control. So the process of circumscribing the self involves realizing what's outside of your control, other people, the past, the future, emotions and things which affect me are incapable of touching me. He says, if you realize that difference, and if you understand the mind in control of all of this, we create the inner citadel within which the self can find serenity. He says, yourself, once protected from the vicissitudes of life outside your control, is capable of doing what is just, knowing what is true. So the discipline of assent is more than just analyzing all your impressions. It also means understanding the true self in all of that, understanding who you are in all of that. And what that is the divine self, the similarity with the self. The Stoics say, if you understand that citadel of calm and peace and quiet inside yourself, you're recognizing your divine self. Although the Stoics don't explicitly talk about or put forward any particular spiritual view and are compatible with whatever a spiritual belief system might be, but they recognize that we are similar to the divine. We have the same nature as the divine. We are of the divine. We are the divine. So the attitude and practice of attention is the spiritual attitude necessary to practice Stoicism. The discipline of assent allows us to kind of rise above the behavior of animals and people who are not in control of themselves, people who don't examine themselves, people who don't examine their lives, and allows us to live as virtuous human beings. Virtuous, again, referring to understanding our place in a world of other human beings around us. So it's not about selfishness. It's not about nothing of this matters to me at all. Again, a common misunderstanding about Stoics and Stoicism. But it's rather about, within all of this, I remain an inner citadel. Practitioners of Eastern faith systems, yoga, Buddhism, know that that is a core idea. And certainly we don't believe that that represents something which is unemotional and indifferent in the way that means I don't care. The Stoics do tell us to be indifferent, but they don't say it means you don't care. It means be aware of your emotional reactions to things, and be aware to the extent that your emotional reactions drive your behavior and drive your judgment of and value judgment of those things, drives your definition of what those things are. And if you're constantly examining yourself and constantly drawing lines around yourself, you will eventually create not only the inner citadel, but a peaceful world for yourself to live in. Marcus Aurelius says, remove the judgment and you have removed the thought, I am hurt. Remove the thought, I am hurt, and the hurt itself is removed. That is the ultimate creating a reality Imagine a world where everything is peaceful and harmonious and nothing is angry or sad or scared. That world exists. It is the inner citadel. Learn to live it. It doesn't separate us from this world. It allows us to approach this world with calmness and equanimity and virtue with respect for other human beings. Imagine how different our reaction in the traffic could be. It doesn't need to be the road rage reaction, because you're the only one who suffers when that happens. Find the inner citadel.